Good morning, my name is Larry Carr, and I'm an occupational health and safety consultant based in the north of England. My resume consists of working within departments of conservation restoration within major cultural heritage institutions of the UK. I am fortunate to have worked at several of the UK's well-known museums and galleries, including the Tate, British Museum, and the Science Museum. Currently, I'm employed part-time as Collections Hazards Advisor to the Science Museum Group. This group consists of 4 popular museums specializing in science, technology, engineering, transport, and media. And I've been employed with these museums for over 10 years. I'm also an independent freelance health and safety consultant since 2017, working with many UK museums. I specialize exclusively in health hazards found within the artifacts of cultural heritage. I like to summarize my work as helping people work safely with collections. One of my common activities is to share my knowledge through training courses, teaching students and giving presentations. One such example is a short course that I offer through international academic projects based in London. And for the time being, this course is available online to anyone in the world. So if you're interested in my subject specialization and are able to follow in the English language, then I encourage you to look out for the next online course. So thank you for giving me the opportunity at this 3rd technical conference. It's my great pleasure to be able to give you a short presentation called Working with Collections Hazards, a Perspective from the United Kingdom. Please forgive me that I don't speak Catalan. And as you can tell, I'm reading from a prepared speech for the benefit of the translation. So the purpose of my presentation is to describe some of the most commonly encountered examples of health hazards found in the UK's industrial, scientific, and technology collections. This is a large and complex subject area, so I have selected only a few examples that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. I will, of course, outline some of the potential health risks from working with these examples. I will try to put this in the context of how people working with museum artifacts in the UK are likely to be at risk. Then I will briefly explain how the risks from these hazards are usually managed within UK museums. I will only describe the basic approaches. I will also note any aspects of UK law that compel museums to act in certain ways. It is not my intention to imply that here in the UK, museums are doing things perfectly. They are not. What I present today is best practice that we would aspire to. I hope that this presentation will stimulate interest in your own situation. I hope it will allow you to make useful comparisons with the cultural heritage that you encounter in your professional or academic practice. I hope that you will see similarities with the precautions and measures that we are taking in the UK. At the end of the presentation, there will be time for questions, but I also invite anyone to briefly describe their own experience, for it will enable me to learn about your situation at your own cultural institutions. I hope we can learn from each other. So let me begin by defining some examples of what I call collections hazards. There are various similar terms and expressions used in the UK. We sometimes say hazards in collections or object hazards. What I mean is health hazards which are intrinsic to an artifact of cultural heritage. We can establish that there are 2 broad groups of these hazards. First, the hazardous substances or the materials which artifacts are made from or contain. Some examples of hazardous substances which are particularly relevant to industrial, scientific, and technology collections include asbestos, radioactive materials, toxic metals, carbon tetrachloride, polychlorinated biphenyls, and batteries. I'm going to cover all of these hazardous substances in this morning's presentation. Second, for hazardous physical properties of artifacts or physical hazards. Some examples of physical hazards include artifacts which are pressurized, under a partial vacuum, are sharp, have moving mechanisms, are heavy, or are operating. I'm not going to cover all of these physical hazards in any detail, but I will give a few examples at the end of the presentation. As I have already stated, this is only a partial list. Asbestos is the first hazardous substance I will present. Asbestos is the name given to 6 different types of naturally occurring fibrous minerals, and the image on the left is chrysotile asbestos, which in the UK we also call white asbestos. Chrysotile is the world's most abundant type of asbestos and therefore became the most commonly used type of asbestos. All asbestos fibers have useful properties, and none more so than fire and heat resistance. They can also be woven into textiles, such as this fire blanket. They are excellent insulators of heat, moisture, and electricity. They are inert to water. They were commonly used in steam pipework and high-pressure connections. Here is an image of an example of asbestos found between the pipe connections inside the engine room of a ship. Asbestos fibers were also used for vibration dampening, sound insulation, and the filtration of gases and liquids. Asbestos fibers were compressed into gaskets used for combustion engines. They were mixed with substances such as cement and resins and made into durable composite materials like vehicle brakes. They were also added to plastics as reinforcement, particularly phenolic resins, such as this Bakelite switch. Today in the UK, we are aware of more than 3,000 different types of materials to which asbestos fibers were known to have been added. The legacy of the UK's industrial heritage, certainly since the late 19th century and for most of the 20th century, has left us with millions of tons of asbestos, mostly inside buildings, but also sometimes inside artifacts of cultural heritage. Asbestos fibers are dangerous to health. It's been established that breathing these fibers can increase the risk of acquiring incurable and usually fatal diseases such as asbestosis, lung cancer, and mesothelioma. We can be exposed to asbestos through breathing it into our lungs. Individual asbestos fibers are comprised of thousands of microscopic fibrils. When a material which contains asbestos is damaged, asbestos fibrils will be released into the air. If we are in the vicinity of the airborne fibrils, then we can breathe them in. They are small enough to bypass the body's defenses, our natural defense mechanisms. They can penetrate into the deep lung at the alveolar region. Here, the body struggles to eliminate asbestos fibrils, and they can trigger effects that may eventually lead to disease. There are no immediate health effects from breathing in asbestos fibers. Instead, these effects are slow and often go unnoticed for many years, for decades. For all these reasons, it is important to prevent damage to asbestos-containing materials. And if we encounter asbestos in historic artifacts, and the artifact is in already a poor condition, then it is more likely to be damaged and more of a danger when handled. Asbestos was banned in the UK in 2000. However, the ban only applied to new uses of asbestos. All of the asbestos already in use before 2000 continued to be permitted. Today, museums must take precautions wherever asbestos is found. The current approach in the UK is to manage asbestos in situ, to ensure asbestos is in an adequate condition and, if possible, leave it where it is. From a museum perspective, we must reduce the risk of damage to asbestos in artifacts, but we do not have to remove asbestos. Museums have a legal duty to manage asbestos. The duty starts with the identification of asbestos in artifacts. This is often done with expert assistance from professional asbestos inspectors who visually examine artifacts. If a museum permits sampling, the inspector can take suspect materials for laboratory analysis using polarized light microscopy. Following the positive identification of asbestos in an artifact, an assessment of the level of damage and the risk of future damage is made. Recommendations are established to reduce the risk of damage. The museum will decide what is appropriate for the artifact. Consolidation of the surface of asbestos-containing materials reduces the risk of the release of asbestos fibers. Sometimes, the asbestos-containing material may be too damaged to repair and will need to be removed. If the artifact is not significant to a museum's collection, then it will be disposed as hazardous waste. The image here shows a British Second World War gas mask containing an asbestos filter. The filter has been consolidated and the whole artifact placed inside a sealed display case. The UK's asbestos hazard warning symbol appears on the side of the display case. Museums also have a duty to provide safety information to anyone who is likely to be at risk of causing damage to artifacts, such as employees, researchers, volunteers, students, and contractors. The next type of hazard commonly associated with industrial, scientific, and technology collections is ionizing radiation. Radioactive materials can be found in artifacts such as minerals, scientific toys, medical equipment, clocks and watches, compasses, vehicle instrument dials, gas lamps, glassware, and ceramic glazes. Here are a few examples. Radium paint was used in the UK from the start of the First World War until the 1960s. The paint is radioluminescent. It glows in the dark due to the radioactivity of radium, or at least it used to glow in the dark because the effect was relatively short-lived. However, the radium in the paint will remain radioactive for thousands of years. The example shown here is an instrument from the cockpit of an aircraft. You can see the radium-painted numbers are an orange-brown color compared to the white non-radium-painted numbers. The reason only some of the numbers are painted with radium is because it was incredibly expensive and had to be used in moderation. The center image is of a selection of gas mantles. Gas flame lighting became common in the UK in the early 19th century. Towards the end of the 19th century, an improvement in the brightness of gas mantles or gas lantels was achieved using a device called a gas mantle. Some types of gas mantles were made with thorium, which is a radioactive element. These are very fragile and brittle meshes, which can turn to powder if not handled carefully. The image on the right is another example of the industrial use of thorium as an additive to optical glass. These artifacts are single lens reflex camera lenses from the 1970s, which are slightly radioactive. Other types of optical glass with thorium include microscope lenses and television broadcast cameras. The types of artifacts that I've just described are not dangerously radioactive. It would be unlikely for any person to be harmed through brief, careful handling of any of these artifacts. Yet safety cannot be ignored because repeated exposure to ionizing radiation, and particularly internal exposure, may increase the risk of ill health in the long term. Radioactive materials contain atoms with unstable nuclei that emit different types of ionizing energies and particles. They have sufficient energy to ionize other atoms. They can disrupt the bonds that join atoms into chemical compounds. And if these chemical compounds are part of living tissue, such as the cells of our body, they can be disrupted, damaged, or destroyed. If the cell's nucleus containing the genes is damaged, then there is a risk of cancer, whilst damage to the genes of reproductive cells may cause inherited defects, meaning that a mutation may be passed on to a person's children. We are all constantly exposed to tiny amounts of ionizing radiation called the radioactive background. The amount of radiation in our bodies is exposed to is called a dose. The dose received from the radioactive background is considered harmless. Some of the dose comes from outside of our bodies, such as from the ground and from space. This is called an external dose. Some of the dose comes from things we take into our body, food, water, the air that we breathe. This is called an internal dose. Exposure to ionizing radiation from artifacts of cultural heritage is in addition to our exposure to the background. In the UK, many radioactive artifacts are not capable of causing doses substantially above the background. But each time we handle these artifacts, they will slightly increase the dose we receive. However, when handling radioactive artifacts, there may be a greater risk of harm from internal exposure. Once radioactive substances are inside the body, they may significantly increase the risk of harm. For example, radium is chemically similar to calcium and deposits within the bones. Radiation from radium causes necrosis of bone tissue and increases the risk of bone marrow cancer. When working with artifacts of cultural heritage, there are two ways in which radioactive substances can enter the body: ingesting radioactive contamination and breathing in radioactive gas or radioactive airborne particles. The age and condition of heritage artifacts means it is likely to we are likely to encounter contamination, such as flaking radium paint or broken thorium gas mantles. It is therefore possible, when handling these artifacts, to inadvertently ingest small amounts of radioactive substances through hand-mouth contamination, or to breathe in radioactively contaminated airborne dusts. Radon is an invisible, odorless, radioactive gas. Radon's connection with this topic is that it is the first decay product of radium. When energies and particles are emitted from a radioactive atom's nucleus, the atom transforms into a new isotope or element. This is called radioactive decay. This phenomena means that any source of radium in an artifact is also a source of radioactive gas. The amount of radon emitted from an artifact containing radium will depend on how much radium is present and the ability for the gas to escape into the environment around the artifact. It is well established that radon gas can accumulate to significant concentrations within an enclosed aircraft cockpit containing radium-painted instruments. Improving passive ventilation, for example, by opening the cockpit canopy or windows, will reduce the radon exposure risks to people entering inside the cockpit. Removing the radium-painted instruments from the cockpit will eliminate the radon risk altogether. If neither is possible, then it will be necessary to prevent unauthorized people from accessing the cockpit. In the UK, museums are required by law to prevent unnecessary exposures to ionizing radiation. Where exposures are unavoidable, museums are required to keep them to the lowest practical level. The management of radiation risks in a museum collection often starts with the identification of sources of ionizing radiation. Museums can often do this through using radiation monitoring equipment, such as a Geiger counter. If you have the right knowledge and the correct equipment and conduct a survey carefully, then it is usually straightforward to identify most common types of radioactive artifacts. Potentially, some research may be required for less commonly encountered radioactive substances and for those that cannot be detected with a Geiger counter. Once a radioactive artifact is identified, the amount of detectable radiation will determine the risk. Calculations can be made to decide whether the risk is acceptable or not. If the risk is not acceptable, then measures will be taken to eliminate the risk altogether or to reduce it to an acceptable level. In the UK, it is common to move small radioactive artifacts into a designated secure radioactive source store. Training and information will need to be provided to museum staff who are responsible for radiation protection activities, such as managing the radioactive source store. In the UK, it is also the law that museums take professional advice from an independent radiation protection advisor. The next hazards are toxic metals. I'm going to use examples of mercury, lead, and arsenic. They are usually encountered as the most common. However, many other toxic metals may be encountered in industrial, scientific, and technology collections. Here is an example of a mercury switch. Mercury is a metal element which is liquid at room temperature. It is a very dense and extremely mobile liquid. Mercury is also an electrical conductor. In this object, the mercury is contained inside a glass bulb, and when the bulb is tilted, the mercury can move from one end to another. At a certain position, the mercury makes an electrical circuit between two wires. Mercury switches were once a common technology in ignitions, thermostats, and timers. The second image is of a type metal made of lead used in a printing press. Lead is a malleable metal with a relatively low melting point. It forms alloys with other metals. It is also abundant and therefore cheap. For these reasons, lead alloys were ideal for making movable type. Type could be quickly cast from molten metal whenever it was needed, and the type, when it was no longer useful, could be melted down again until it was needed. The third image is of a bottle of arsenic solution used as a medicine. Arsenic is not technically a metal at all, but it does share properties of metals, such as its ability to be alloyed. For this reason, it is colloquially known as a toxic metal. Arsenic is highly toxic, but very small doses of arsenic, such as a drop of this solution, can be tolerated. The effect of ingesting tiny quantities of poisonous arsenic was observed to stimulate the body, for example, by raising the blood pressure. For centuries, it was believed, therefore, that small doses of arsenic could be beneficial to health, and it was tried for treating diseases including typhoid fever, malaria, and syphilis. Toxic metals are not all equally poisonous. Arsenic is more toxic than mercury, and mercury more toxic than lead. Cases of acute poisoning caused by a single exposure to these toxic metals are very rare amongst museum workers within the UK. This is likely due to the way in which these metals are often encountered in small quantities or contained inside glassware. Wherever this is not the case, the risks will be greater. For example, conservator restorers working with industrial collections will be aware of the health risks of removing lead paint, soldering with lead, and cleaning spilled mercury. The health risks from toxic metals found in artifacts are greater whenever there is repeated or long-term exposure. Repeated exposure to these toxic metals at levels which do not cause any immediate harm can still increase the risk of illness and disease. For example, toxic metals can accumulate within tissues of the body if they are ingested, inhaled, or absorbed faster than they are metabolized or excreted. This can result in cumulative poisoning. Anemia is one example of cumulative lead poisoning. Lead is also a reproductive toxin. A person's exposure to lead can be passed to their unborn child or to a child they are breastfeeding. Lead poisoning to a fetus or baby is far more dangerous than to an adult, as it is known to cause developmental brain damage. Repeated exposure to some toxic metals may increase the risk of cancer. Lead is associated with an increased risk of stomach cancer. Arsenic with an increased risk of bladder, lung, and skin cancer. The risk of chronic exposure to these toxic metals can be reduced by taking basic safety precautions. For example, the risk of ingestion can almost be eliminated by adopting good hand hygiene practices like wearing gloves, not touching the mouth and nose, and washing hands after finishing a task. In the UK, chemical safety legislation requires museums to know which toxic metals are in their collections. This can be achieved through reviewing artifact documentation, visually checking artifacts, or using analytical techniques such as portable X-ray fluorescence. Excuse me. Museums are required to assess the risk of exposure to people to these toxic metals. In many cases, exposure is minimal and nothing needs to be done. However, there may be people doing activities such as conservation treatments who are at greater risk. Conservator restorers who are self-employed are required to conduct their own risk assessments. Museums must prevent or reduce any significant exposure risks. One example of this is providing people with protective nitrile gloves to wear while handling artifacts. Museums must also check safety practices are being followed and that they are working effectively. Sometimes it is necessary to remediate unacceptable risks. Examples of this may include treatment of lead corrosion and cleaning up spilled mercury. In this way, it is possible to reduce or even eliminate risks. Museums are also required to provide information, instruction, and training to people who are at risk. I will now turn attention to some other hazardous substances that can be found in the industrial, scientific, and technology collections of museums in the UK. Carbon tetrachloride is an organic compound with a distinctive odor. It was once commonly used as a fire extinguishing liquid. The image here shows a hand-pumped fire extinguisher from the early 20th century. Carbon tetrachloride was also used as a dry cleaning fluid for clothes, in lava lamps, as a pesticide, and was added to refrigerants and aerosol propellants. Carbon tetrachloride is toxic through ingestion and inhalation. Exposure to low concentrations can cause mild headaches and nausea. Exposure to high concentrations can lead to acute liver and kidney damage. It is also harmful via direct skin contact. In the UK, many uses of carbon tetrachloride, such as in refrigerators, dry cleaning chemicals, and spray cans, were banned because carbon tetrachloride is a CFC gas and dangerous to the Earth's ozone layer. This ban means that museums must prevent carbon tetrachloride in artifacts from leaking into the air in large amounts. In most cases, this will not be a problem for museums, but if they are unsure, then it's possible to check by using a portable volatile organic compound monitor. Polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, are a group of synthetic compounds of which there are 209 different types or congeners. PCBs were found to have many useful properties, including thermal conductivity, electrical insulation, and chemical stability. PCBs were widely used from the 1930s inside electrical transformers and capacitors. They also found diverse uses as additives into other substances, such as lubricants, hydraulic fluids, plasticizers, pesticides, fire retardant coatings, carbonless copy paper, printing ink, construction sealants, laminating adhesives, and investment wax. Acute exposure to PCBs can cause liver, skin, and eye damage. Some types of PCBs are known to be extremely toxic. Inside the body, they are metabolized into even more toxic compounds. These PCBs are known to cause cancer and are dangerous to the development of an unborn child. It was discovered in the 1960s, after just 30 years of use, that PCBs had contaminated every corner of the planet. This global environmental disaster led to banning the production and then the new uses of PCBs during the 1970s and 1980s. Today, in the UK, if museums have historic artifacts containing significant amounts of PCBs, then these artifacts may require registration with the government. It's possible to detect PCBs using gas chromatography with an electron capture detector. And the final topic under hazardous substances represents a variety of different chemicals found in batteries. Batteries store chemical energy. When connected to a circuit, they release electrical energy. Some of the substances inside batteries are corrosive, toxic, flammable, or react energetically in contact with other substances. Common examples include lead, sulfuric acid, sodium hydroxide, potassium hydroxide, zinc chloride, mercury oxide, cadmium, organic solvents, and lithium. The design of a battery aims to control these chemical reactions, but the physical condition of the battery and any remaining chemical energy stored within will influence the risks from keeping and handling batteries as artifacts of cultural heritage. Substances can leak out from within batteries. The image on the right shows the typical product of a deteriorated alkaline battery. Potassium hydroxide escapes the battery, reacts with carbon dioxide in air, and produces potassium carbonate. A different hazard exists with lithium batteries. Physical damage to lithium batteries can cause a thermal runaway, leading to a fire or an explosion. Non-discharged batteries of any type could also pose a risk of an electrical shock or, in unusual circumstances, cause a fire. Museums that are thinking about batteries in their collections will want to identify the type of battery, assess its physical condition, separate removable batteries from parent artifacts, and consider the remediation or disposal of batteries which pose risks from long-term storage. Artifacts that require working batteries will need to have them maintained and charged separately from the artifact. So this concludes some examples of hazardous substances which can be encountered within artifacts of industrial, scientific, and technology collections. So very briefly, here are some examples of physical hazards. Pressurized hazards include artifacts which contain gases or liquids above atmospheric pressure. Two examples are found within this aircraft landing gear. The aircraft's tires contain air, and the gear contains hydraulic fluid. Inflated tires and charged hydraulic systems require inspection and maintenance in order to prevent catastrophic failure. Glassware under a high vacuum can be found in electrical devices such as diodes, fermionic valves, rectifiers, X-ray tubes, and cathode ray tubes. The example shown here is a fermionic valve. Glassware under a high vacuum may violently implode if it is physically damaged. This can be prevented by correct handling and packing of glassware. Some glassware under a partial vacuum contains a gas. The most common examples of gas-filled glassware include fluorescent light bulbs, which contain small amounts of mercury vapor. Provided that the light bulb remains intact, there is no risk of exposure to mercury. And finally, let's consider operating artifacts. Museums of industry, science, and technology often demonstrate how artifacts work. This can create transient hazards that occur whilst the artifact is operating, such as heat, light, noise, vibration, and electricity. A working historic railway creates a number of transient hazards, the most serious of which is the hazard of being struck by a moving railway vehicle. I've presented a range of health hazards found in industrial, scientific, and technology collections. I've explained their risks. I've explained how museums in the UK should be managing these risks. I will conclude by summarising a variety of additional measures which museums commonly implement in order to improve the safety of work with any hazardous artifacts. We call this collections hazards management, and it will often include prominently labelling artifacts in storage with hazard warning symbols, recording data about the hazards of artifacts and if anything has been done to manage their risks, ensuring that anyone working with hazardous artifacts has a good awareness of their hazards and risks, assessing the risk to people working with artifacts. In the UK, this is usually a formal process which produces a document called an activity risk assessment, reducing risks to people working with hazardous artifacts through remediation, developing written safety procedures for how to work safely with artifacts, and finally, regularly reviewing everything to ensure it is working effectively. So this is the end of my presentation. Here is an email address if you would like to contact me directly. I've also included 2 useful links from the UK's museum sector, which cover aspects that I have presented to you this morning. I hope we can now spend some time listening to your questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Larry Carr, very much for your interesting presentation. So now you will open the floor for questions. Se hará a través del chat y iré preguntando. Yo tenía una pregunta que es igual por motivos de traducción no la he entendido. Al final de la presentación ha dicho que se tenían que etiquetar y especificar los materiales, que se tenía que poner por escrito el activity. No he entendido la traducción, lo siento, hay algo que me he dejado en el final. No sé si se me entiende la pregunta.
Do you mean lava lamps under the carbon tetrachloride topic?
No, no tengo traducción y ahora. A ver. Al final de la intervención, ¿sí? Había el etiquetado, nos hacías un resumen de todo lo que tenía que hacer el museo, ¿vale? Los protocolos, cómo teníamos que etiquetar, y hablabas de que las personas tenían que ser conscientes de cómo trabajar con un activity. He perdido la traducción, lo siento. ¿Podría repetir esta última diapositiva, esta última?
Yes, if you'll permit me to just to share my screen again with that slide, I can go into a little bit more detail. So the example shown on the screen here is a mock-up of how I perceive the type of hazard warning labeling which we would typically use within UK museums. So it's composed of the object's data, the object identification number, a description of the object, and then information which is relevant to the object's hazards as far as people have been able to identify them, or perhaps the suspicion of a hazard if they have not been able to conclusively identify it. So we can use symbols, language to help make that more prominent to people that might be approaching the object when it is found within a store environment. I want to emphasize that I wouldn't expect to find lots of museums with lots of labeled objects in relation to hazards, because for many museums, this is a relatively new thing that they are commencing on. We also wouldn't put labels on objects which are on display within our exhibition spaces, because the labels have very little value in that context. But within a stored collection, they are valuable because they provide a last line of defense to someone who may be unaware of a hazard contained within an object. Would you like me to talk about other aspects as well, or is that okay?
No, yo creo que basta. Ahora tengo una pregunta de Mireia García que plantea que ha hablado de las válvulas de rectificación de mercurio. ¿Es posible retirar el mercurio de su interior sin peligro de romper el cristal al perder el estado estable de vacío?
In my experience, no, it wouldn't be. They are fused glass. They've been blown for their purpose, and the electrical wires have been inserted into the glass while it's being fused. So it's a one-way process, I believe. You would only be able to remove the mercury by damaging the glassware ultimately. So that I believe would be unacceptable and not essential for the management of mercury. Mercury, if it's contained within a sealed vessel, such as that bulb or a thermometer, would be absolutely acceptable. It would provide very little risk to anybody. So the precautions for working with objects of that nature are all about preventing damage to the glassware, stopping the mercury from escaping. That's the only important thing.
Vale. Yo tengo otra pregunta, porque tenemos muchísimo material, posiblemente que esté producido con amianto, y más viendo su intervención todavía más. Ha hablado de técnicas para detectar gases, pero para detectar que el amianto se está deteriorando, ¿existen modelos o algún tipo de aparato que nos pueda avisar anticipadamente? ¿O necesitamos un técnico que venga a controlarlo?
Very good question. So within the UK, the legal framework is very prescriptive for the identification of asbestos within the built environment, and museums are obliged to follow that legal framework. And in the framework, the only acceptable identification methods for asbestos are visual assessment by a professional, competent person who's had hopefully sufficient training to understand what they are looking at, or from destructive sampling, which we call bulk sampling, which is then sent to a laboratory for independent analysis using PLM, polarized light microscopy. However, your question is relevant because there are novel alternative analytical techniques. However, I have to emphasize that in the UK, they are not permitted in the legal framework which exists, but they use near infrared spectroscopy. So they use non-destructive techniques, which I believe open up huge possibilities for the identification of asbestos within cultural heritage, because we would obviously not wish to have destructive sampling of artifacts. So any non-destructive analysis is very, very attractive. There are several limitations to this process, as I understand it. I've used it myself many years ago. I'm not sure if it's been improved or refined, but when I used it, one of the obvious limitations was that you cannot get a reading on dark colored material. The material has to have a minimum sort of reflective index. It needs to be able to return a signal to the device. So that's one limitation. So for example, black material receives no results at all. Another limitation is that you must get the instrument to within about 1 millimeter or 2 millimeter of the surface of the asbestos containing material. And that means that you're putting yourself at some risk of either being very close to a dangerous material, or even damaging the material if you accidentally collide the instrument with the surface of the asbestos. And the third thing is really about the cost. So in the UK, these are very expensive devices. I believe a recent quotation I saw was in the region of £10,000. So it's not within the capability of many museums to own or possess this type of equipment. Ultimately, I hope that the price will come down, the technique will become accepted as part of the way in which we are allowed in the UK to assess materials for asbestos, and that then it will help us immeasurably. But at this time, it's all something of a theory, something of a dream, perhaps.
Vale. Xavier Serra pregunta, ¿qué técnicas se utilizan para consolidar el amianto? Es verdad que has hecho has hablado de una máscara de gas que se hizo un consolidamiento del amianto.
Yes, so within museums practice in the UK, it's become the convention to try to use materials which are acceptable to conservator restorers for the encapsulation of the surface of asbestos-containing materials. So we would consider to use things like copolymer acrylic substances, acrylic copolymer substances, such as, without recommendation or endorsement, Lascaux, consolidating medium, and other similar types of acrylic copolymers. And that has been a practice which museums have developed for, I would say, more than 10 years now. However, we are concerned that we haven't thoroughly considered the long-term stability of these materials. And it's actually one of my intentions to try to encourage research in this area, to try to encourage a scientific and materials-based project, which would look at the stability of encapsulation materials for asbestos-containing material. However, the other materials are sometimes used. In the built environment, there are thick, durable, rubberized paints, which are commonly used to apply over the surface of asbestos-containing materials. And some museums might reluctantly accept the use of these materials, but it's obviously a concern to conservator restorers because these materials may cause damage which is unacceptable to the artifact, or indeed other materials in the vicinity, such as delicate metals due to off-gassing and so forth. I would like to see much more information shared by museums about this, because I think it's a little bit of a dark art, if that expression makes sense. It's something which we have experimented with and found useful and desirable in order to try to meet the need to encapsulate the surface of asbestos materials. But I think there is much more knowledge to be gained.